Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, foes and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible, I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. To accomplish that goal, I suggest gear that allows for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. Today's class is the Necromancer and the elite specialization of choice is the Reaper. I'm going to talk through two different build variants, an open world roaming build using blood magic and a conditioned DPS build using soul reaping. But as always, let's talk some pros and cons first. The build does really good damage with 36k DPS on the golem with a fairly simple rotation. It has good survivability in open world with blood magic and minions, and it does very strong cleave damage. Everything can bleed, even metal. One of the downsides of the build is that relying on Reaper's Shroud can be an issue under high pressure. Also, the build suffers from some combo field problems, but more on that later. Okay guys, it's time for an odd one. A build that most players don't even have on their radar because they think Doom only uses a power build. But in my opinion, Condi Reaper is actually the better Reaper. Now I want to be honest with you, Condi Reaper has a few issues as I mentioned before, some of them it shares with Power Reaper. But after playing it for a while and finding some remedies for these issues, I found this spec to be so much fun to play that I had to make a video on it. I like the theme of it, it does good damage, is very survivable with the right trait choices, and it's just incredible to pump out this much bleeding on your own. As a starting point, let's discuss the general playstyle of Condi Reaper first. Condi Reaper exploits some very cool trait synergies and combo fields to apply lots of fear, blindness and most prominently chilled. With the traits of choice, all these condis will entail bleeding stacks through Chilling Darkness, Shivers of Dread and Deathly Chill. Paired with native bleeding stacks from other traits and skills, that amounts to over 100 bleeding stacks at times. Similar to Core Necro, Condi Reaper has access to Reaper's Shroud, which shares the same shroud mechanic as the Core Necromancer and will therefore feel quite similar to it. This replaces your health bar with another resource, Life Force, that you accumulate by various means, but mainly via deaths around you. So the more stuff dies around you, the better. Now on the upside, Shroud protects you from taking damage, but it also prevents you from being healed. It does not prevent barrier application and life siphons, which will become important later on. Similar to Core Necro, Reaper relies on the Shroud mechanic for some of your highest damage combos. Since Shroud depletes with incoming damage, Reaper becomes harder to execute well under high pressure. And that is why Reaper is often seen as problematic in group content, because you need to stay in Shroud for a certain amount of time to guarantee the highest damage. Now Condi Reaper has one advantage over Power though. The time you spend in Shroud is much shorter compared to Power Reaper, making it easier to handle. But before we go on, note that I do not run Greatsword in this build. I know Reaper without Greatsword is not real, but Staff is just better. And you still get the Skith roleplay in Shroud, so take it or leave it. That said, let's dive into the Shroud skills. The Shroud auto attack is pretty basic. It inflicts strike damage and the last hit gives little life force. We're usually not using this a lot since we fill the Shroud time with other skills. The second skill is Death's Charge. This is a leap skill, so keep in mind that this launches you into melee range. This applies blind and is the only skill in Shroud that does so. This is important because you can apply chill and bleeding through blindness only every 3 seconds via Chilling Darkness. If you want to avoid launching you into melee range, you can also swap to the trait Doomfire in Soul Reaping and fill the time you'd use to cast this to auto attack in Shroud. It's only a slight DPS loss, so feel free to do that. Shroud 3 is a skill with 2 casts. The first one applies an armor that reduces all incoming damage by 20% and grants stability. Within the next 6 seconds after the first cast, you can shatter this armor to apply fear to enemies around you. And every time you apply fear, you also apply chilled. And every time you apply chilled, you apply bleeding. These patterns will repeat for many of the following skills, so keep an eye out for blindness, fear or chilled. Shroud 4 and 5 supply one of the main damage combos in this build, because Shroud 5 puts down an ice field and applies chilled itself. Oh, and it also stuns, by the way. We'll try to use as many combos inside this ice field as possible, because all of them involve applying chilled in some shape or form. Inside this ice field, we always use Shroud 4. This is a spinning channel that damages foes 12 times and applies a stack of poison on each attack. Each of those attacks is a well finisher that applies chilled when used inside the ice field. So this is 12 stacks of 16-second bleeding plus the poison, not too shabby, right? If we then use Shroud 2 inside this ice field as well, that will apply Frost Aura to ourselves, which in turn will chill and bleed enemies that hit us. As the main weapons of this build we have Scepter and Dagger. These involve lots of bleeding, torment and poison application. The auto attack applies a stack of bleeding on its hits and the final hit applies poison as well. We don't use many of these in the rotation, but try to not interrupt them if possible. Scepter 2 is Grasping Dead, an AoE skill that applies bleeding and cripple. It has the same cooldown length as Scepter 3, which is why we use them in combination most of the time. Scepter 3 is Devouring Darkness, and it further applies Torment and grants a ton of life force. This applies stacks of Torment for each condition the foe already has, so do not use this as an opener. Also note that when we use the trait Parasitic Contagion, which we might do in open world, this turns into a single target skill. Dagger 4, Deathly Swarm, is mainly used for each condition transfer, but it also applies blindness. It therefore also applies shield and bleeding if you have not applied blindness in the last 3 seconds. We use this mainly after Blood is Power or Plague Lance to transfer the conditions they apply to oneself to enemies. Finally, Dagger 5 is Enfeebling Blood. This is an AoE skill that applies long-lasting bleeding, weakness and further converts boons on enemies into conditions. So this can be used as a boon strip in situations where it's needed. The secondary weapon of choice is the Staff. Staff has become a really good weapon for condition builds since a recent wave of buffs to it. Staff includes mark skills, which apply lots of conditions. With the trait Soul Marks, they also give 3% life force on each of them, which improves your life force management noticeably. The Staff auto attack itself does not apply any conditions. You should usually not have time to actually use this anyway, as all other skills are better alternatives for this build. Staff 2 is a short cooldown skill that applies 2 stacks of bleeding and regeneration. Use this off cooldown, it's really good for damage. The same holds for Staff 3, Chillblains. This applies poison and chilled and is a poison combo field that you can make use of. Staff 4 is Putrid Mark, which is another condition transfer. You can also use this instead of Dagger 4 to transfer the conditions from your corruption skills. This is also a blast finisher and would try to blast the ice field with this after exiting Shroud. That will apply a Frost Aura in AoE around you. Finally, Staff 5 is Reaper's Mark, which applies Fear. Through this Fear, as you know, it applies Shield and Bleeding again. This build, in general, puts out a lot of CC damage over time. You have lots of blindness, chilled, fear, you pump out stuns, you have weakness, cripple, all that stuff. Let's move on to utilities. As the healing skill we have 2 options. The main skill I usually go with is the Blood Fiend minion. This is free damage and instance content in an open world. It's a damage sponge that allows you to stay behind and damage from range against tougher enemies. You can also use Signet of Vampirism in group content for a more reliable heal over time. This also allows you to use it to make allies siphon health from enemies, which is a small group benefit. In the next slot we have a mandatory skill, Well of Darkness. This applies blindness and shield on every pulse, and it pulses 6 times. So this alone allows you to maintain a lot of bleeding, and every pulse is applied to 5 targets. This should be the first skill to cast in AoE scenarios. Next up, you should always slot Blood is Power. This skill is absolutely insane for damage, especially if you manage to transfer the condition it applies to yourself to enemies. You should always reserve either Dagger 4 or Staff 4 for this, since you'll deal a ton of damage to yourself otherwise. This also applies 5 stacks of might in an area on cast, giving it group utility. Transferring the conditions isn't always easy in group content due to all the cleanses that you have around. More often than not, the conditions are cleansed off before you have any time to actually transfer them. The highest damage option for the 4th utility skill is the Bone Fiend. This may seem weird at first, given that it just applies cripple every once in a while and immobilize on demand. The important part, however, is its regular attack that doesn't have a tooltip. Each regular attack of this consists of 2 projectile finishers, which will apply chilled when flying through an ice field. Unfortunately, these projectiles don't seem to prioritize your own combo fields, making it unreliable in group content. On the Golem it is better than other options, but you can also use the Shadow Fiend for a slight DPS loss. The active skill of this doesn't have a cast time either, and applies both blindness and chilled, again inflicting bleeding. If you want an instant condition transfer, you can also use Suffer here. This makes transferring at least one condition more reliable, and it also applies AoE chill. Another fun option for open world and actually group content versus trash mobs is Spectral Grasp. This is a great utility skill for pulling mobs together. This will also apply chilled and bleeding to all enemies that are pulled. Finally, we have Plague Lance. This should always be used in group content and prioritized in open world. This applies literally every condition aside from Immobilize and Fear, and will further apply bleeding and poison to yourself. Try to combine this with Blood of Power so you can transfer the bleeding stacks together. If you want another damage sponge for open world, you can also use the Flesh Golem. It is more survivable compared to the other minions and has a very strong CC skill on the map. Moving on to gear and consumables. For Condi Reaper you have two options. Since around 2/3 of your damage come from bleeding, it is essential to always max the duration on. The gear option that I always use does slightly less DPS compared to the alternative, but it allows you to swap between all three Necro specs easily. There we use full Viper and Nightmare Runes. Note that this only allows you to reach around 97% duration on bleeding with the Kimchi Pancake food, so you'd have to upgrade it with some Condi duration infusions for 100% or use an Agony Sigil. It's not a big deal though, you can still do great damage with this, as you'll see later in the rotation part. The ideal setup for damage relies on a mix of Grieving and Viper with Krait runes. It's only marginally better though. In this setup you need 30% overall Condi duration in the hero panel to max out bleeding. In my opinion, it's not worth it to invest into the Krait rune gear just for the Condi Reaper build, unless you have full legendary gear already. With this gear setup you can use the standard condition damage and expertise food. Ascended as always is preferable, but it's not needed. If you only have access to exotic gear, you lose bleeding duration. In case you have full exotic gear with Nightmare Runes for starters, you can also put one Agony Sigil on each weapon and run standard condition damage food to max out bleeding duration anyway. Either way, as the utility, use the Toxic Focusing Crystal or the Tuning Icicle as a budget alternative. If you can afford it, you can also get yourself Writs of Master for Malice for a slight damage boost. Let's get to the backbone of builds, traits and specializations. I won't go through every trait in detail here, just the ones that affect the playstyle. The default specializations for instance content are Soul Reaping, Curses and of course Reaper. We'll be swapping in Blood Magic for open world, but more on that in a second. The specialization that you should never remove is Curses. Curses improves basically every aspect of the condition playstyle by making you apply bleeding on critical hits. It further applies chill on blinding enemies, increases the duration of your conditions, reduces the recharge on corruption skills, as well as granting you lots of condition damage and precision. Note that the trait Chilling Darkness can apply on a single AoE skill before going on cooldown, so that it can trigger up to 5 times from a single hit of Well of Darkness for example. If you want some additional survivability at the cost of damage, you can swap the Grandmaster trait Parasitic Contagion in. It heals you for 5% of your outgoing condition damage, so if you deal 10k DPS, you'll be healed for 500 per second, which is pretty strong. This can be worth it for open world since you won't have much healing without it. But keep in mind that this does not happen in Shroud, so it is less effective on Reaper compared to Scourge or Harbinger for example. The second specialization for instant content is Soul Reaping. This drastically enhances your ability to generate life force across the board. It reduces the cooldown on Shroud skills, it increases maximum life force and increases your damage by 10% for 15 seconds whenever you enter or exit Shroud. This becomes very important later on in the rotation. On Condi Reaper, we'll also make the staff marks unblockable and have them generate life force as well as increasing crit chance. We also gain critical damage while in Shroud. If you feel like you use many auto attacks in Shroud, you can also slot Doomfire to make the Shroud auto attacks apply burning on every hit of them. For general open world roaming, we'll use Blood Magic to increase survivability, especially in Shroud. With the traits of choice, Blood Magic will make you and allies siphon nice amounts of health. In Shroud you cannot be healed, but the siphons from Bloodborne, Vampiric and Vampiric Presence still occur. These siphons and other heals outside of Shroud will be converted into Barrier via Blood Bank. This is especially powerful while you are at full health. You also gain healing power based on your health and make allies not bleed out in downstate while you are in range. This makes resurrecting people easier and can be pretty powerful in situations where things get iffy. You will also leave a mark of blood when you dodge, which applies bleeding to enemies and regeneration to allies upon being triggered. Finally, we have Reaper. We'll use the middle traits here. Reaper changes Shroud to become Reaper's Shroud, which drains life force faster than the core Necro's Shroud. Plus, we'll also deal higher strike damage against chilled foes. The most important trait, however, is the Grandmaster trait Deathly Chill, which will make your chill also apply 2 stacks of bleeding. This is the reason why you want to apply chilled as often as possible, because it becomes part of your damage. The trait that you can think about and swap out freely is the master trait Chilling Victory. Soul Eater increases your damage by roughly 2 to 3%, but I like to use Chilling Victory for the extra life force it generates. It makes sustaining Shroud much easier and also grants you passive might in open world. Since you have close to no other sources of boon generation, this increases your damage noticeably, especially since it can trigger on AoE attacks as well. Okay, now that we got skills, gear and specializations covered, we can dive into the rotation of Condi Reaper. The rotation on Condi Reaper requires some muscle memory, but it is fairly easy to grasp. We'll be starting on Scepter and Dagger. The opener involves just casting all abilities on Scepter and Dagger in a more or less fixed priority order. We're not going to use the minion skills unless you want to apply CC via the Bone Fiend active or use the Shadow Fiend. In the opener, start with Plague Lance. With Nightmare runes you should have the bleeding left over. Unfortunately, it occasionally happens that the bleeding gets transferred so that you have poison on you. I'm not sure why it happens, maybe you guys can enlighten me. Then use Well of Darkness, Enfeebling Blood and Grasping Dead. Now we still have the 2 casts of Blood is Power and Devouring Darkness left. Use the first cast of Blood is Power first, then fill the gap in between them with Scepter 3, and then use Blood is Power the second time. We're doing it this way to make sure that if you transferred the bleeding from Plague Lance, the poison runs out before we use Dagger 4 to transfer the torment and bleeding from Blood is Power. After this, if you want the really simple rotation, you can start off by going into Shroud. The Shroud loop is always the same. 2, 3 twice, 5, 4, 2 and exit. Now stay on Scepter, cast skills on cooldown until you see the Soul Barbs buff run out and practice the Shroud loop. Just make sure to use Dagger 4 after Blood is Power casts to transfer the torment and bleeding. You can use this for initial practice or stick with it if you want the easy mode. It can still get you up to 34k DPS or so. The full rotation isn't much more complex. It involves swapping to Staff before going into Shroud. On Staff, use Staff 3 and 2. Do it in this order, because otherwise Staff 3 might not be available when you exit Shroud later. After those 2 Staff skills, enter Shroud. Use Shroud 3 once, Shroud 2, then the second cast of Shroud 3 and a couple of Shroud auto attack hits. Then use Shroud 5 and immediately after Shroud 4. In the later loops, Shroud 4 would still be on cooldown when you enter Shroud. Then simply do autos after Shroud 2 and 3 until the 4th skill is at around 1.5 seconds of its cooldown. At this point use Shroud 5 and then Shroud 4 immediately after. After the cast of Shroud 4 is done, Shroud 2 is available again, use it and then exit Shroud. You're now back on Staff. Here use Staff 4 first to blast the ice field before it runs out. This way you put Frost Aura on allies and yourself, applying bleeding to foes that hit you. Then use Staff 5, 2, 3 and go back to Scepter and Dagger. Here, the first 2 skills should always be Scepter 2 and 3. This is done so we can use them again right before going back to Staff. On Scepter and Dagger, follow the priority list I mentioned in the beginning. Again, always make sure that you try to transfer the conditions from Blood is Power over with Dagger 4. After you cast Scepter 2 and 3 a second time, go back to Staff and repeat the loop from before. It can happen that Plague Lance becomes available when you go to Staff or right before you go into Shroud. Use it then. It's better to squeeze it in. It takes some time to get used to the timings of this rotation, but you should quickly see good enough results. Start with a simple rotation to get into it and gradually work your way up. Note that in groups the effectiveness of the Bone Fiend, as I said before, depends on the combo field. You could simply slot the Shadow Fiend or Suffer instead and use them on cooldown. The Bone Fiend is nice for the immobilized though, which is why I mostly keep it anyway. Alright, that is it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this slightly longer video was insightful for you and made you want to try Reaper. See you next time and happy soul harvesting.